Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. We are in round 13 of our coverage of the 2021 Candidates Tournament race to see who will face Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. And we have an extremely important game today, round 13. White's going to be played by Alexander Grischuk and Black's going to be played by Anish Giri. The importance of this match is this is a 14-round tournament, so we're coming down to the very end of it. In first place in the tournament, we have Ian Nepo, and he drew today, which means that Anish Giri, if he wins, can go tie with Ian. Now, Ian does have the tiebreaker against Anish. They played in round 1 and Ian beats Anish, so he does have the tiebreaker. So if they go level in points at the end of the tournament, then Ian would be declared the champion. But if Anish Giri loses, then the tournament is over. There's no way for him to catch up. So Anish Giri needs to at least get a draw to give himself a shot, and if he wins, well, then tomorrow is going to be fireworks, because then it puts a lot of pressure on Ian. He can't just come out with a draw or a loss. He pretty much needs to think he has to win, because Anish Giri, if he wins this game, is just on a roll, winning pretty much with white. Black doesn't really matter. So Anish playing the black pieces. That's why this match is so important. So we'll go ahead and get started with Alexander Grischuk. He plays pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn c4, and then after e6, knight f3, we see pawn to b6. So the queen's Indian defense, something we don't see all too often. And after pawn to g3, bishop to b7. This is kind of the old main line. It used to be bishop to b7, but bishop to a6 is kind of the new line that a lot of players like to play. But bishop to b7, really trying to control these light squares. It really becomes a hyper-modern approach for black, meaning trying to control the center of the board with the minor pieces. Knight here on f6 and the bishop here on b7, but really both sides trying to control these light squares, because you're going to see from white, bishop here to g2, flanking the bishop to the king side of the board, castle on the king side, and then both sides really aiming down on these light squares. Bishop down here to b4 check, bishop to d2, and then a very curious exchange, in my opinion, for Anish. And, coming into this, knowing that he needs to get a win, definitely prepared this specific line, plays pawn to c5, and after bishop takes here on b4, pawn takes on b4. So bishops exchange off the board, and Anish leaves himself with the double pawns on the b file. Don't see this all too often. We'll see how that works out for him. Castle on the king side for Alexander, and then we see castle on the king side for black as well. Knight to d2, pawn here to d6, queen to b3, attacking this pawn here on b4, pawn to a5, and then Alexander Grischuk decides, yeah, I'll go ahead and allow you if you want to get rid of your double pawns. I'll play pawn here to a3. Does not take, instead plays knight to a6. Could have just taken here, and then pawn to a3. Maybe pawn h6, rook over here to b1, double attacking his pawn here on b6. I think that is an approach that could have happened if you don't want to have the double pawns, but he seems fine with the double pawns. Plays knight here to a6. Says, yeah, if you want to take here, I will go ahead and take back with my knight here on that's currently on a6. So rook to d1, centralizing the rook. Always want to get your rooks into the center of the board, or if there's semi-open or open files. Right now, white does not have any of those, since has not exchanged any of the pawns off the board. Queen here to e7, knight comes back here to e1. It's just awkwardly placed here on f3. Can't really go anywhere. And eventually you do want to get your light square bishop involved into the game. Now, as soon as that happens, we do see an exchange right here, and then pawn to h5. So many times in chess, if your opponent moves backwards, knight here to e1 being an instance, then it's usually correct to be pretty aggressive, because they are on the back foot. And so Anish looks at this and says, let's go ahead and trade off here on g2, and then just push forward here with h5. We see knight to c2, pawn takes here, some exchanging going on, and then rook over here to b8. So with that exchange, queen here on b3, attacking this pawn here on b6. Pawn up here to e4, just really controlling the entire center of the board here from Grischuk, and then pawn to e5. Queen over here to d3, just centralizing a little bit more. Knight back to c7. Rook to b1, getting it on the semi-open file, as we've talked about before, and also just putting pressure on this b6 square that right now black has to play defense with the rook here on b8. Knight over here to e6, and then rook to b5, attacking the pawn here on d4 and the rook, both eyeing down this pawn here on e5. Black continues with rook to e8, and I really expected just pawn taking here on e5. That's part of the reason that rook to b5 happens here. After pawn takes, rook takes here, knight to c5, attacking the queen. So maybe the rook takes the queen here. You see the knight come down, take that. Okay, hey, if you just want to exchange material, that's fine. Rook takes on e8, attacking this pawn right here. Maybe king to f3, not as bad to get your king involved into the game if the queens come off the board. That's the major threat that you have, especially with the bishops gone as well. Not as much harm on this king here. So, you know, in this spot, white's up one pawn in material. There are multiple, 3 pawn chains, so maybe just didn't like that setup. But at the end of the day, after the move rook to e8, decided not to take here, instead play pawn to h4. Pawn to g6 from black, pawn here to f3. Knight comes back here to d7. Knight to f1, so another one of those spots where we see material come back and all of a sudden Anish Giri decides to go ahead and attack his opponent. So pawn takes here on d4. Knight takes, knight down to e5, attacking the queen. Queen falls back to e2. There is an exchange right here, and then knight comes up to c6, attacking the rook. Rook falls, queen to e6, knight to e3. So just getting it back involved into the game here. Knight to e7, queen to d2. So eyeing down this pawn here on d6. This is the last central pawn that black has. If white can really take this pawn and start to chip away, it's going to be very difficult for black to hold on to this setup. And we see pawns to f5. I really don't like this move at all, because after queen takes here on d6, it's a really, really tough spot. And not only that, but knight takes, or knight to c6. Now the pawn takes on f5, so just blowing up even more of the material. Pawn takes here, queen takes, rook takes, knight takes here on f5, and all of a sudden you look at it and you say, wow, white is up a few pawns in material. How is this going to go well for black? Well, spoiler alert, it's not going to go well. It's just too much material for Anish Giri towards the end of the game to be giving up here. Not sure if he just didn't calculate a specific move in the variation, but at the end of the day, not very good. So rook to d6. Grischuk's definitely in the mindset of, hey, let's exchange material. I am up a couple pawns in material, so if we just exchange, this is going to be a pretty easy in game. So rook to d6 says, yeah, if you want to go ahead and take, I will exchange. That is a fine trade. Anish brings his rook back, says, yeah, that's not really what I'm going for right now. Rook back to d4, knight to c6. Rook comes back here to d2. And then what may be somewhat surprising, I don't know why he would just trade off material, but just snap played. Rook takes here on d8. And then rook over here to d5 says, yeah, I'm not going to allow you to get your rook involved into the game. You usually want to bring it to the second rank if you're black. Just come down here, attack the king, get behind enemy lines, start to gobble up some of these pawns here in the endgame. Says, yeah, we're not going to have that. So there's an exchange, and you can see this is just very tough for Anish Giri to hold on to. Playing one of the top players in the world, this is a pretty easy endgame. And so there's some maneuvering here. Knight to e5. Knight comes up here to d6. Both sides get their kings involved into the game. But eventually it comes to a setup where there's just no way for black to really hold on to this. And then after knight to c3, king here to f5. Great little outpost here on e5. So you can see starting to block off a lot of the squares here. King can't come to e5, e6, and now f6, where it had been retreating to. Has to come back here to g6, just not involved into the game at all. And then after pawn to g4, says let's blow up the king side of the board. Pawn to b5, but then knight to c5. Says let's exchange off the knights, but then there's just no stopping. The king could just gobble up all these pawns over here. White still has a pawn advantage on the king side as well. At the end of the day, Giri recognizes that his dream of winning the Candidates tournament to go on to face Magnus Carlsen has fallen. He loses, and that means that Jan is the champion. Jan Nepomniachtchi is the Candidates tournament champion. He will face Magnus Carlsen at the end of the year. And if you remember from round number 1, he was my dark horse. I thought he might have a really good shot at winning the tournament. I think he's, out of all the competitors, I do think he has the best shot to beat Magnus Carlsen. His style is very unpredictable, and I feel like he can get Magnus off his game. He has a pretty good record against Magnus Carlsen, so that matchup is going to be extremely exciting in November. But this will conclude our coverage of the Candidates tournament, just because tomorrow I don't anticipate that there's going to be too many fireworks, as pretty much the main standings are pretty much set in stone. Jan has won the tournament. Even if he loses, Anish wins, he does have that tiebreaker. So hopefully you enjoyed this tournament coverage. We did half the rounds last year, then we took a year off because of everything going on in the world, and now we have done the last 6 rounds here over the past week or so. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this and really excited about the World Championship later this year. It is going to be a good one. So thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next video.